So our first talk this morning is strategies for teaching the non or reluctant reader. And I have a lot of experience in this area in a few different ways. In one aspect, I worked for 3 years at a place called the Institutes for the Achievement of Human Potential in Philadelphia, where I had an opportunity to work with a whole team of people that would teach programs of treatment to brain-injured children. And this ranged from, so mildly symptomatic, you would barely notice, a light autism, all the way to deaf and blind and paralyzed, and Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, everything in between. So I have a bit of a background in child brain development, and so that has been very useful in my work of traveling and teaching and helping people with the arts of language. I also have some children. I have 7 children. And I think if you have enough children, you're basically guaranteed to have at least one who will have some difficulties in reading. And unfortunately, there's a lot of anxiety about reading in this modern world. I think a lot more than perhaps there used to be. But what I'd like to do in this talk is kind of go over some possible causes for difficulties in reading, and then talk about some practical strategies that you could apply. And in no way is this meant to be an exhaustive, cover all the bases and teach you everything that you could possibly want to know about the problem of kids who don't like or can't read. But we do have a lot of resources on our website, iew.com/ I think it's learning-differences, but I'm sure you can find it. And we have interviewed on our podcast a number of reading and dyslexia experts. So there's a lot more to be unpacked, but this will give you the big picture, I hope. So we'll look at the first area, which is vision. Visual problems leading to challenges in reading or dislike of reading, or sometimes a flat-out inability to learn, at least to learn the way you imagine you would like them to learn. And we'll go through a few different possible visual problems, the first one being the easiest to solve and the least common. And that would be acuity. That just means being able to see well enough to look at the letters on the paper. And usually parents figure out pretty early that maybe this child doesn't see everything that you would think they should, and you take them in to an ophthalmologist, and lo and behold, yes, glasses are going to be helpful. I remember with our oldest daughter, when we figured this out, we were living rurally in Montana, and thought, she just probably needs glasses. So we took her in, she got some glasses, and we were driving back out into the country, and she's staring out the window. There's cows out there. Yes, sweetheart, there have always been cows out there. This is Montana. But it was kind of a delight, for her to be able to see what was there, but didn't know it. So acuity problems are usually quick to diagnose and pretty easy to fix. And of course, we have so much good opportunity for kind of the perfect type of lenses to help people in that category. Another problem that can occur is a convergence of vision problem. So we have 2 eyes, and we use them together to get our depth perception. And we also use them to track things through space very well. And so when we are able to use 2 eyes well, then we can see at near point and focus at near point the way we should. But some children, for one reason or another, have some sorts of brain, you could call it brain injury. I think actually, the term brain injury sounds a little bit heavy. it sounds kind of scary. And it could be. But on the other hand, you could look at it and say, well, all of us are brain injured, right? I mean, on one end of the spectrum, you have neurologically flawless, and on the other end, you have comatose. Everybody is somewhere in between. It's just a matter of degree and location. So that kind of helps when you're looking at your children. You say, well, of course, they're all brain injured, right? Because none of them are perfect. But when we look at convergence of vision, we can see that it's often an injury that is connected a bit with the midbrain area. So a little bit of neurophysiology, some of you know this, but we have our brainstem and the pons, and then we have the midbrain, which is over the pons, and then we have two cortices. And these cortices are actually not connected with each other until they hit the top of the midbrain, which is the corpus callosum. So you could, I don't recommend this, but you could take off the top of your skull and put like a piece of cardboard or a ruler in between your two cortexes, your two cortices, and it would go all the way down till it hits the corpus callosum. So what this means is that all of the information that we process through our cortex has to go through the corpus callosum to hit bilateral function, right? And so with our laterality, with our vision, right, we see that sometimes you get a little bit of a brain injury in the midbrain, and then that affects the cortical ability to process higher level cortical information. So you can test convergence pretty easily if you just kind of, put a finger or a thumb or something and just run it right in up to the tip of the nose, and you should see the eyes just go like straight in as close as they can, cross-eyed, we would call it. And I don't believe there's any evidence whatsoever that your eyes can get stuck. This is something I heard as a young child, but I don't believe it's true. Nevertheless, if you see that you get in fairly close and then one eye kind of goes off to the side, then what you might notice is that that's going to impede the ability to use those two eyes together at near point to track text across a page or to track something close up. And it's interesting because you'll sometimes meet kids who have very good acuity. They could spot a fly on the wall at 50 feet. But at near point, things get a little bit fuzzy and difficult. And sometimes you can work on this with some glasses. One of the things that we did at the Institutes for the Achievement of Human Potential was we would have kids get back on the floor and do creeping on their hands and knees, because that cross pattern motion helps to organize the midbrain. And you often see kids who didn't do creeping on their hands and knees sufficiently will have a weakness in that area. Maybe they figured out how to sit up and kind of butt scoot across the floor, or they transported themselves by rolling until they figured out how to stand up and walk. So there's a developmental period there with creeping, crawling on the belly, developing a cross-pattern motion, and then creeping on hands and knees in order to create those connections between the cortices through the midbrain and the corpus callosum. So I don't know that it's terribly reasonable to take an older child and put them back creeping, hands and knees a mile a day, which is what we did in more serious cases. But it is a good thing to note that if you have children who are, in that developmental period, you want to keep them on the floor as much as possible. You want them to be creeping on their hands and knees a lot before they stand up and start cruising around by holding on to things and then walking across the room. So the longer the floor period, the greater the neurological benefit when it comes to midbrain and visual convergence of vision. One reason why that's true is you have to move your right hand in your left leg and then your left hand in your right leg, otherwise you fall over. So nature kind of works it out so that you're forced into this cross-pattern motion. The other thing that happens at that time is you start moving faster, which means you need depth perception. And so the convergence of vision allows you to know how close you are getting to something so you don't crash into it, which is a very handy skill to have as an adult. Moving then a little further into visual difficulties, we have the problem of laterality. Now, laterality refers to sightedness, right? And this is a genetic thing. We are genetically right-sided or left-sided, right-handed or left-handed. True ambidexterity is very rare, and it's not necessarily a huge advantage unless it comes after laterality is firmly established. Now, one of the things that can happen is a mild brain injury. It can be prenatal, neonatal, postnatal, any kind of trauma. And like I said, all of us are brain injured. All of us have less than perfect brains. And one thing that can happen, let's say that you are a right-sided person, right? You're supposed to be right-handed, but you have some injury in an area of your left cortex, which would correspond with the right hand. So then what can happen is the other side of your brain will kind of try to take over and do the job of the part that was injured. You see this in a fairly obvious way with people who have a severe stuttering problem, right? So the dominant hemisphere, left brain and right-handed people, would be your language, executive, logical function part. And if you have an injury there, then the other side of the brain will kind of say, well, I'll do that for you. But the one that's supposed to do it would say, no, it's my job. And then the other one would say, no, but you're not doing it, so I'll do it. Like siblings, like the two hemispheres of your brain, right? No, I'll do it. No, I'll do it. No, I'll do it. And so you see this when someone is stuttering, they will struggle to exercise their will over their cortices and say to one half, shut up and let the other one say it, right? And so you see that kind of battle. And that's probably one of the most obvious ways that this will manifest in the language area. You can also see it in a manual area. And this is where you might have a child at 5, 6, maybe even 7 years old who will write for a while with one hand and then switch and write with the other hand and switch back and forth. Now, that's not a problem in the early period, so 3, 4, but usually by 6 or so, laterality starts to become more firmly established. But if you've got a child who's switching the pen or the crayon or the pencil, then that might be a clue that you could have a potential laterality problem. The most difficult time is when you have visual problems where the brain is actually fighting for the dominant image. So try a little experiment here. Close one eye. Now open it and close the other one and switch back and forth. What happens to the image? It's shifting, right? So your dominant image is shifting according to which eye it's coming through. So that would not be a problem for most of us because we exercise control over our brains and we've told, hopefully, the correct hemisphere to get the dominant image and the other hemisphere to support that and not fight for it. But with children who have that injury in the dominant hemisphere, that can be happening. It can be moving and going back and forth because, one side of the brain is saying, I'll see it. No, I'll see it. No, I'll see it. No, I'll see it. You can also look at the problem of mixed laterality, where you might have a person who is, say, right-handed, but left-eyed. My wife is right-handed and left-eyed. I have a daughter who is right-handed and left-eyed. And it's not a huge problem, but it can interfere with the smoothness or the ease of processing visual information. You can test this both at far point and near point. For example, one way to test it is ask someone to, shoot a gun right at your eye. So why don't you all try this? Shoot me, my fist. Shoot my fist. Aim really carefully, right? And shoot my fist. Okay, so Sarah, you're right-eyed and right-handed, so that's fortunate. Karina, you are appearing to be left-eyed and right-handed, so you may have some mixed laterality that way. And Jessica, you're pretty much lined up. You seem to be left-eyed and right-handed there. And it actually can change at far point and near point as well. Now, it doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you, but it would be interesting to go and say, how was reading for you when you were young? Was it easy or was it a little bit harder? And if it's a serious problem, you'll get kids who will just be flipping back and forth. And they'll actually move their heads a little bit as they're reading to just get the right eye at the right angle, and then they fight and shift around to the other way. This can be assisted by a variety of things. The most common that we would do is patch the subdominant eye for a period of time. Now, I'm not recommending anyone try this. I would say, however, if you suspect a mixed laterality or a shifting laterality problem, you would consult a behavioral ophthalmologist. It's a very specific type, and not just the guys who prescribe glasses, but they're the ones that kind of get into the whole world of eye exercises and this idea of patching the subdominant eye, retraining the dominant eye to see what it's supposed to see and be in charge of seeing that. Well-organized neurologically and laterality, you would like to be right-handed, right-footed, right-eyed, right-eared, right everything, so that you would attack life kind of in a unified manner. But as I said, sometimes we have mixes there, and that is just something to know. And if you see it as a real impediment, like I said, consult an expert in ophthalmology, a behavioral ophthalmologist. Then we get into the category which is where a lot of kids are, and this would be the true dyslexic. Now, the word dyslexic generally is applied to anyone who's having a hard time learning to read, or anyone who's having a hard time reading after they've learned. And there can be various causes for that, but the true dyslexic, the way I use the word, is really very, very interesting, because these people have a gift to see the world in a completely different way. And I always recommend two books. One is called The Gift of Dyslexia, which does not seem to be the gift that everyone wants. However, it is an excellent book by Ron Davis. He was a dyslexic autistic adult who taught himself to read when he figured out what his brain was doing. And so the Davis Dyslexia Foundation exists to help people fall in this category. Another excellent book is called The Dyslexic Advantage by a couple, husband and wife doctor team, IDs. And I have actually interviewed them on my podcast, and it's available for you. But it seems as though this true dyslexic actually just does see the world differently than I do. And it has to do with this kind of mental aptitude for kind of picking something up and looking at all sides of it and processing all of that as visual information and being able to put it down and know that. This is why these true dyslexics very often become very successful in things like engineering or architecture or mechanics or design or art, because they see things that the rest of us don't see. For me, for example, if I see a chair, I just see a chair. I only see the part of it that's there. I don't imagine the backside and the underside of the chair. But the true dyslexic would pick the chair up and kind of spin it around and get the whole thing in their brain and put it back down, which is wonderful for three-dimensional items. However, if you are looking at text on paper, it's a two-dimensional thing. So what happens is they try to pick up the letter or pick up the word and spin it around and get the whole thing inside. And that doesn't work very well, because what can happen then is the letters can spin. And that's very often where we get letter reversal problems or word reversal problems. And of course, I have seen children who can write an entire word in an exact backward mirror image way. So it's like they know the word, they know how to spell it, but in their brain, it's still spinning around and they just grabbed it at the wrong time, which is also kind of funny because you'll meet kids who will reverse letters sometimes, but then other times not. And so this problem. So my son, I have 7 children, all are grown now. My son was the only boy of the 7, and he was number 6 in the lineup, next to youngest. And he exhibited this kind of facility from a young age, and reading was extremely, extremely hard for him. In fact, he did not read 3-letter words until he was almost 11. He didn't read 4-letter words until he was 11, and he didn't read a book of any sort until he was 12. But he had this ability to see things, to spin them around in his mind. And so he would draw these really amazing, interesting kind of 3-dimensional-ish pictures. And he had this really amazing spatial intelligence. And so it was hard getting him to do this. And we finally went ahead and paid someone from the Davis Dyslexia Foundation to come and work with him and a few other kids in our homeschool community where we were living at the time. And this was not a cheap thing. And she came, this dyslexia expert, and they spent the entire first day making letters and punctuation marks and numbers, the whole alphabet, out of clay. And so all the kids were sitting there modeling these letters out of clay at the end of the day. And I thought, I just paid $1,000 for someone to make clay letters with my son. And why, though? Because Davis discovered that if the thing could become 3-dimensional, he could understand it better, whereas the 2-dimensional thing was spinning so often. And so this making it very solid. And I kind of remember from my childhood, I don't know if any of you are young enough, I'm probably the oldest person in the room here, but I remember these alphabet blocks. And they were made out of wood, and they had textured letters and animals on them. You remember that? I love those things. Anyway, I'm just wondering if, for a lot of kids, the 3-dimensional nature of the block and the raised textured letters wasn't somehow helpful in that case. And I don't see things on the market like that very much anymore. But I always thought, well, that might be useful. Or those plastic letters that you can put on the refrigerator that had the magnets, and those being 3-dimensional. Anyway, another thing that kind of mystified me at the time and still does was this particular exercise that she taught my son, where I am not an expert. I do not know how this really works. I'm just approximating it. But it seems as though what you do is you you put your point of reference behind yourself, and then you look through yourself to see the thing you're trying to see. And somehow this helps. And I said to this woman, I cannot understand what this would be. And she says, of course not. You're not dyslexic. And I thought, well, okay. So then later I asked my son, can you do this thing where you like put yourself behind yourself and look through yourself to see what you're trying to see? He goes, yeah, it's pretty cool. So there are a number of people who have been able to find and refine and communicate to dyslexic people ways to help, make their brains work better for this purpose of reading. And one of the things I have noticed, both with my son and with countless other kids, is that right around puberty, they will tend to get this kind of burst of power, right? Especially the boys. Now, you don't always like how this burst of power manifests, but it does happen. And what very often happens is it allows them to have the will, the inner strength, to exercise that will over their eyes and brain and make their eyes and brain do what they're supposed to do to be able to decode letters and words and numbers and do all that. And so this can happen, 12, 13, 14. So there's very common kids who they can't read, they won't read, they can't do it, 8 years old, 9 years old. You start to panic, 10 years old, 11 years old. That's where we were, right, in panic. And then, boom, 12, 13, suddenly now it's easier. 14, reading, not a big problem. I know at least 5 men I can name personally who did not read a book until their late teens, all of whom have now advanced degrees, master's or doctoral degrees. I know a man who didn't read a book until he was 20 years old, and he has a PhD in theology, which I think requires some reading. I've not done that, but I assume. So those are a few directions you can go if you think the problems are visual by nature. I would say that the visual problems are easier than the next category, which is auditory processing issues. Now, you would think, well, why would auditory processing connect with the problem of not reading or not liking to read or not being able to read well? Well, language is primarily auditory. It's verbal and auditory in nature, and only, secondarily or tertiarily does it become a printed thing, right? And so we have to know words in order to read them. Okay, I'll give you a good example of this. Let's say you're a little kid and you're reading along and you've got word attack skills and you can sound out stuff and you see this word and you try to figure it out. So you say, s-l-e-g-h, s-l-e-g-h, sligha, sligha. There is no such thing as a sligha. Therefore, it cannot be sligha. Well, how do you know there's no such thing as a sligha? You've never heard it, right? But the problem is, you might see a word that is a word, but if you've never heard it, you wouldn't know what it is. Now, if you're a little kid and you're reading and you see this sligaha business and you say, it can't be sligaha, you kind of go back to the mental drawing board and you say, well, it's got to be something else, and you stare at it a while. And if you're lucky, you recognize E-I-G-H. Yes, that's that A sound, like in 8. And so you try again, sleigh. It's a sleigh, and you're so happy you figured it out. But that only works if you already know what a sleigh is. Right? If you don't know what a sleigh is, you might be able to say it's a sleigh, but you can't comprehend it. You don't understand it. That might as well be a sleigh. So now, this is where the auditory function comes in. We really only, especially in the developmental period, first 12 years or so, we really only are going to read and recognize words that we already know. Therefore, the auditory input of language is foundational to the decoding of written language. This, I think, is one of the biggest problems happening with the decline of reading in most of the kind of public sector, is because the language coming into kids' brains is not building the database of vocabulary that allows them to read more complex stuff. It's a very interesting researcher. I believe he's at Virginia Commonwealth. Daniel William. He wrote a couple interesting books. Why Don't Kids Like School is one of them. But I heard a presentation once where he presented some really interesting data about comprehension and dyslexia. So they had kind of some groups of kids. One group of kids played baseball and was dyslexic, right? Diagnosed, okay? Another group of kids, no dyslexia, didn't play baseball. They gave both groups of kids a little story about baseball. Who had better comprehension? The kids who played baseball. They actually understood it better, even though they had the reading impediment, than the kids who didn't have experience and could probably decode all the words, but those words didn't mean as much. So this is why breadth of experience and large quantities of auditory information are very, very important for developing vocabulary, understanding more complex syntax, etc. We're going to talk about that in more depth later today. But here's the problem if you have an auditory processing challenge. You don't necessarily hear every word that someone is saying. You don't necessarily hear, this is weird to me, but you don't necessarily hear the words in the order that they're being spoken. They can get scrambled up on the way in. Or you can have this echoic memory where you say something to me and it takes a period of time, right? Can be up to several seconds before I get the words you are saying. And so there's this delay, and that makes it harder to understand the words that are being said when you're kind of hearing but not understanding while you're trying to understand what you heard right before that. You could imagine how this could be very frustrating for children, this auditory processing. And so this can be a real challenge when it comes to reading and understanding more complex information. Because when you're reading, most of us, what are you doing? You're talking to yourself, right? You're seeing the words, you're saying them to yourself in your mind, you're hearing that, and you're understanding that. But if you're not hearing what you're saying to yourself, then the words just go by and there isn't the comprehension you need. And that can be caused by the neurological problem. It can be caused by lack of vocabulary and experience. It can be caused by the third problem, which would be just attention issues, right? Now, I suspect that all of us are a little bit or more ADHD, and this term gets bandied around a lot, and you've got ADHD, and I don't personally know a person who doesn't have a little bit of ADHD right now. And it's partly environmental, right? So there's a neurological component, I would agree, but it's also partly environmental in that our attentions are being continuously scrambled and interfered with, mostly by the technology in the world around us. So this is one reason I think we see a lot more problems of maybe the genetic predisposition or the neurological injury but it's being exacerbated by the screens and the chaos and the busyness of the visual and auditory world that we have as modern humans. So probably one of the most valuable things you can do is try to minimize the distraction of technology and get a calmer, quieter, less sensory, overstimulating environment for kids like that. And I fear that as schools are increasing the number of screens and not just the number, but the number of hours per day that kids are engaged in screens, we're going to see a continued or even more rapid expansion of problems having to do with attentiveness and language processing and probably mental health as well. So those are probably some of the most common causes, the visual category, and there are lots of subdivisions there, the auditory processing and the attention challenges. So now, what are some strategies that we can use? Well, starting with the very most basic idea is larger print. I don't know exactly how universal this is, but it seems to me that when you look at things that are written for children, curricular materials, if you will, they start with little kids, kindergarten, first, second grade, whatever, nice, big, 18, 24 point font, something. And then right around third grade, they, bam, shrink it down, 12 point Times Roman. And for a lot of children, that right there just makes it harder. If your problem is visual and it's an acuity or a laterality or a convergence or even a true dyslexia, the fact that it's smaller makes it harder and it requires more energy. Sometimes kids with these visual impediments will have to expend a tremendous amount of energy to do the reading thing. I guess the best comparison I could come up with is, can you remember a time recently when you were trying to read something, but you were tired? Maybe it was late at night, or you hadn't got enough rest or whatever, and you're trying to read and your eyes go a little unfocused. And then you realize, oh, my eyes are unfocused and I'm not reading this. So at that moment, you have a choice. Either get your eyes back in and continue, or just give up and go to sleep, right? And it's a fair choice. The problem is with kids, right? They don't quite know how to express that, and they're using a tremendous amount of energy to do this thing, and they can get tired quickly, and they're just constantly trying to put their eyes back and get it in shape. That's a hard one. And one of the easiest things to make it easier for all of us is just bigger print, bigger type. So if you have a child that would benefit from this and you have materials you want them to read, you should invest in one of these nice little multifunction copier printer things that has an enlarging function on it. And then you can just make the text bigger and it will be easier for them to read. It will require less of that intense output to focus and pull it in. I have actually noticed this with age as well, that it is easier for me to read things that are a little bit bigger. Also, brighter light makes a huge difference. This studio was very nicely done, and the light is very bright, but not so much that you have to squint. And I can read 12-point print without glasses, without reading glasses. But if I go into my office where it doesn't have this nice, beautiful light, I got to put those glasses on to read the same thing. So light and size can make a big difference. Another thing that is very, very helpful is copy work. Now, you would think, wait a minute, that sounds like the hardest thing there is to ask a dyslexic kid to do. Yes, which is why it's helpful, right? Because it's hard. But one of the really interesting researches that I came across Some years ago, I was writing a talk called Paper and Pen, What the Research Says. And one of the things that was demonstrated again and again is that children are much quicker to recognize when they are reading a word which they have written several times. And so the best way to get a word intimately into a brain so that they will see it and just know what it is more quickly, rather than have to try to sound it out for the 200th time, which I have seen, is copywork. And so 15 minutes maybe, I would say keep it short, but do it every day. And you can start this, probably as soon as kids are old enough to copy somewhat accurately, 6, 7, and you can keep it going, 8, 9, 10. My son was doing copywork of things that he couldn't necessarily read very well, but by doing it again and again, he was reinforcing that pattern, because it's about sequence, right? So I set up a challenge for him, because when you want a child to do something that is horrible to them, they can spend a tremendous amount of time and energy complaining, whining, arguing, trying to convince you that this is not fair and that they should not have to do it, and that they are by far, too hungry, too tired, too unable to do it. So you have to shift it from being a chore that should be avoided into a challenge to be accomplished. And for many children, my son in particular, an economic system is what was needed. So when I determined that he was going to do this, I said, okay, son, here's the deal. You copy 100 words a day. Okay, you can copy anything you want. And I believe he chose the first thing, the Usborne Book of Knights and Weaponry, medieval weaponry. That way he could copy a few words, see a cool picture of a dagger, restore his soul, copy a few more words, peek at a battle axe, feel better about the whole thing. But I said 100 words, and I picked 100 words because that's what I thought he could do in about 20 minutes, if he paid it, if he kept on it. I said, if you finish all 100 words in 20 minutes, you get 25-cent bonus. I will pay you a penny for each word that you copy, and if you reverse a letter, we'll let that one go. But if you reverse the position of 2 letters, then it doesn't count. If you miss a capital or a period, that doesn't count, a punctuation mark. And every time you whine, complain, or argue, you lose 10 cents. And you could go negative. And I own your bank account. Okay, you have this type of leverage over a 10-year-old, right? So anyway, it was very interesting because he couldn't necessarily read it all, but he was attending to the detail of how to get those words on paper with space, with capitals, and all of that stuff. There was a lot going on. And it was the worst thing that you could ask this child to do. I mean, he literally would have rather shoveled manure from one pile to a different pile than have to put 100 words on paper. But, very interesting, he did not whine or complain or argue one time because he was highly motivated. This money, by the way, did not go into his pocket. It went into a special fund called the Airsoft Weaponry Purchase Fund. And at that age, 10 years old, he lived to play airsoft. This was the whole purpose of being alive, was to play airsoft with his friends. And so he was very happy to have access to a way whereby he could purchase airsoft weaponry. And so he did this, probably kept up for about 16 months. It was a long haul, and he went through various different things that he copied. I tried as an experiment on myself, just to see what it would be like to do it. I copied the book of John. And he says, "Why are you doing that?" I said, "Well, I think it would be interesting to see what happens." And I said, "Do you want to join me?" He goes, "No, I'll do Revelation." I think he liked the idea of, the warfare and the 6-winged many-eyed seraphim soaring aloft and all that stuff. So anyway, it went on for 16 months, and he kept, and the great thing about airsoft weaponry is it's cheap plastic junk that breaks as soon as you start playing with it. So you need a constant resupply. But here's the really interesting end of this story, and this exploded my concept of the value of doing this. I knew it was good, but I didn't realize what it was doing. One day I came back from a trip, and I was got his little book where he was doing all the copy work, and I'm counting, and I'm reading this thing, and I'm thinking, this is odd. There's nothing particularly wrong, but there's more spelling errors than normal, and it's just odd. It was a little story about a boy who fell in a river, and a dog jumped in and grabbed him and pulled him to shore and saved his life, maybe, which was actually an event from my son's early life when he was about 4. So anyway, I'm reading this thing, and I said, so is this your copy work? He said, yeah. I said, so you copied this. Is that what you're telling me? He said, yes. And I said, well, where did you copy it from? And he said, from my brain. Is that okay? It blew my mind, because what I realized was that this process of seeing it here, internalizing it, reproducing it over here, was building this pathway between the brain and the paper, right? Consistently, 15, 20 minutes, every day, for more than a year. And he got to the point where he said, I don't need that thing. I have it here. And made that transition, which kind of brought about the natural end of that cycle of copy work. But it was also corresponded with him being 12 years old, starting to get that power, starting to exercise his will over his neurology and do these things that previously, even a short year before, were so overwhelming and difficult. So copy work is hugely important. I would assume that almost everyone listening here understands that we have had a very bad method of teaching reading in this country for a very long time. And it's kind of comes in waves. In the early 1900s, there was this idea of the look-say method, where, oh, well, when we look at a word, we don't look at all the letters and figure out what they sound like and sound it out. We just look at a word and know what it is. That's how adults read. So why don't we just teach kids to just look at words and know what they are? And so this look-say method came into being, and it was a disaster. And then there was kind of a reaction against that, and there was a little bit of a revival of a phonics-based approach. And then there was the whole language approach, and so now we're going to try to do both. But we're going to encourage kids to kind of guess at words from the context rather than stop and figure out what it really is. And that kind of had a high precedence for a while, and then it kind of faded down. And even the reading and writing people at Columbia Teachers College a couple of years ago said, we admit, finally, that phonics is a necessary part of learning to read. But the problem is it's been done very badly for a long time. And I think in schools of education, it's very haphazard. You may or may not get any instruction on how to teach reading with phonics. And you even go some places where the term word attack skills is frowned upon. I guess it's too violent for schools. I don't know. So one of the problems that we have seen is that because reading was taught badly, because the basic vocabulary of people has been declining pretty steadily since the advent of television, and then declining much more rapidly in the last 20 years. What we see is it's harder now to get kids to read. So what they have done is say, well, what we need to do is start earlier. That would be the solution. So if we have 8-year-olds who aren't reading very well, we have to push it harder in second grade. Well, now this is not working. So what's the solution? Push it harder in first grade. Well, that's still not working. So what's the solution? You just keep going. And then they come up with things that should not exist. Pre-K reading curriculum. This should not exist. Now, is it possible that you'll see 4-year-olds who want to learn to read or 5-year-olds who just do? Yes, in fact, you'll notice that you can have, if you have enough kids, you'll notice that some of them, you really struggle trying to teach them to read, and then the younger one just sucks it out of the air, and you hardly have to teach them anything. They just get it. And so that's fairly common. But I think what we've done by pushing reading earlier and earlier institutionally is we have successfully created a lot of anxiety for a lot of people. Because if you try to teach reading to a child who is not developmentally ready, they will hate it, right? And they can hate it so much that they will still hate it even after they have become developmentally better able to learn to do it. And there are countries in the world that outscore us academically in every way. Scandinavian countries come to mind first, where they really don't worry too much about reading and writing stuff until the kids are around 8 years old. And then you hit a point where almost everybody is past that. And of course, some children learn to read early, and some moms teach their kids to read, and some kids have a stronger interest. But the thing I think that we would benefit from is attending to two things. Number one, this idea of learning to read through copy work and spelling. Because if a child knows how to write a word, they'll recognize it more quickly. In fact, they don't even have to write it. If they know how to spell the word, they will recognize it much faster. I taught a preschool for a couple years, and it was a very small. Actually, it was not a preschool in the institutional sense. It was a group home daycare, which meant I had 12 children between the ages of 3.5 and 5.5 in a 600 square foot converted garage from 8:45 in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon, all by myself. But it was a highly glorified daycare because I was trying to do everything well. And I had some kids, 4 years old, 5 years old. I knew they were not going to read anytime soon because I could see what was going on with their eyes, right? And I understood them. But I taught them all sign language, not the words, just the alphabet, A, B, C, D, E. And we did this every day. And then I taught them how to spell words using their voice and their fingers. And what I noticed is that if I taught them the words that were in the little books they were reading, they would read those words first. Those are the ones they could lock onto because they kind of knew the letters, they kind of knew the names of the letters, but they had this auditory and kinesthetic pattern of the sequence of letters so that when it appeared in a different sensory pathway, there was a connection there. So the other thing I think we want to do is understand that reading, we tend to define very narrowly, right? We tend to define reading. Reading is looking at something that has letters that make words and words that make sentences and being able to internally understand, hear and understand what that is. And that's reading. That's a pretty narrow definition. Reading with your eyes. Not everybody reads with their eyes. Blind people, for example. Many blind people learn to read with their fingers, right? Well, why can't you also read with your ears? That's a valid idea. So if you were to expand your definition of reading as to taking in language through whatever sensory pathways are available to you, and understanding and reflecting on increasingly complex language, that would be a slightly different definition, wouldn't it? And that's why, and we'll talk about this more later, but that's why with all children, but in particular with kids who are having a hard time, either because of visual reasons or attention problems or comprehension issues, it's very, very important to read aloud to them as much as you possibly can. In fact, it's the number one most important thing that any parent can do in any given day to give their children an academic assistance is to read aloud as much as possible. And we can supplement that with audiobooks. And I am a big fan of audiobooks. And I have to confess that while I read a lot as a kid, when audiobooks came into existence, I embraced them fully. And I particularly liked it when you had iPods and you didn't have to buy cassette tapes. Some of you are old enough to remember cassette tapes. And you could just carry these things around. And so how many times, I don't know, dozens, hundreds of times, I have said to someone, I am reading, fill in the blank, or I just finished, fill in the book. And then I have to stop and think, well, technically, I listened to that, but as my son said to me one time, what's the difference, right? What's the difference? And one of the things that does make me sad is when I hear reports of teachers who have told parents to stop reading to their children and make them read on their own. The logic being, if you read to your kids, well, they won't want to learn how to do it, right? Or if you let them listen to too many audiobooks. I've actually had a couple of my sons-in-law worried about a 9-year-old boy who would rather play with Legos and listen to audiobooks than try to learn to read on paper. Can you imagine? But the fear is if we let them just listen to audiobooks all the time, then maybe they won't want to or put out the effort to learn to read. But I would dispel this. I have never seen this happen. In fact, according to the American Library Association, the number one predictor of adults who like to read is having been read to as a child. And so let us use as much opportunity as we can, because when you read to a child, especially if you read to them and talk about what you're reading, this actually pulls up their comprehension, right? So you read to them at a level above their own decoding skills and define words, explain idioms, talk about allusions or connections with geography or history or whatever. That's actually pulling up the reading comprehension. If you don't do that, then the kids just kind of keep doing lateral shifts, and then they hit a point where they just can't read something, and then they won't. And, I hear so many teachers today say of their children, even high school kids, they either can't read or they won't read. They can't write or they won't write. I don't know what to do. And I follow a good number of teachers that I don't personally know. I just follow them on social media because I'm very curious. What is it like on the front lines in middle school today? And that seems to be one of the most universal problems, is they either can't or won't. And until we kind of get parents much more involved and get a strong emphasis on bringing phonics-based, high repetition, solid reading instruction into the schools, I suspect we aren't going to see much progress in this area. And one of the saddest statistics that I heard recently is the national average of reading proficiency of 8th graders is in the 30%. And there are some places in this country, some city school districts, where they're right around 0%, like almost nobody has proficient reading. And you think, well, this is going to be pretty rough. But hopefully that gives you some clues. I would finish up by saying, if you have anxiety about a child who isn't reading the way you wish they were reading, don't let that overwhelm and depress you. Just keep on doing what you know is right, and remember that any number of people didn't read well as children, but became very happy, very successful, very literate adults. So early reading is not an indicator of success. Thank you very much.